Tracy, thank you so much for joining us today. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, no problem. Hi, everyone. My name is Tracy Duran. I also go by Tracy Levine, which is my maiden name. I just recently got married on New Year's Eve, so I'm kind of in that transition point between not exactly knowing what to call myself because I haven't legally changed my name yet, so you can call me either. I just wanted to apologize for a second because I'm actually quite under the weather right now, so if I cough or start sneezing a lot, it's okay. I'm going to make it, but I'm just a little sick right now. So a little bit about myself. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, so I'm really into the Cleveland Cavaliers right now, but I currently live in Cincinnati. I went to the Ohio State University where I majored in production planning and supply chain, and I started with SAP about a little over 5 years ago, right after college. And when I started in SAP, I was a production planning consultant, but I quickly transitioned into SAP Security because there was a need for it at my current consulting firm, and I've basically been doing that now for 5 years. So I currently work for IBM. I'm a subject matter expert in SAP GRC, Governance, Risk, and Compliance, and SAP Security and Authorization as part of the Global Security Services practice. A lot of people always ask me, they're like, why did you become a consultant? You could have done a lot of things after college. And I think my favorite thing about consulting is that you get to work with people from all walks of life, which I really love. Like, I've been on the shop floor so many times moving inventory for my clients, and then I often talk to C-level executives on a daily basis about, you know, the different work that we're doing. So that's kind of just a little bit about my professional background. Personally, I love traveling. I just got back from my honeymoon. We were in Greece, Turkey, and Italy. I went to Peru last year and Thailand the year before that. Kind of my favorite thing to do. And I'm currently deployed on a GRC implementation project in Tel Aviv, Israel, for one of the largest pharmaceutical manufacturers worldwide. So I'm actually going back out of the country tomorrow. And that's it.
Great, thanks so much. Good to learn a little bit more about you. Can you tell us a little bit more about your book and why you decided to write on this topic?
Yeah, sure. So when I started in SAP Security, I honestly could barely spell SAP. So a lot of people often say, wow, you must be really good with computers, you must be really technical. I'm actually not at all. One of the things that I love about security is that once you get an understanding of how it works, just a little bit, it's actually one of the most functionally driven pieces of the SAP, enterprise, because it touches every single piece of the system and it integrates with everything. You kind of get to know a little bit about everything, and I'm way more functional than I am technical. I think the reason why I'm a successful consultant is because I am really client-facing and I do really well working with customers, but I'm definitely not the person that's going to be able to solve every single, computer problem. I don't write code. I'm not a developer by any means. So when I first got into SAP Security, there weren't really that many resources out there that combine the technical and the functional. And because I had no previous security experience, I had nothing to apply it to. And the other thing about a lot of the SAP security books out there is that they just kind of they're really dry, and they also don't